At 71, Walter Hayes had learned not to trust silence on a farm. Silence usually meant something had stopped working. That morning, it was the tractor. He turned the key once. The starter clicked. He waited, pressed the clutch harder, and tried again. Another click. Nothing. Walter sat behind the wheel for several seconds, with one hand still wrapped around the key. Through the dusty windshield, he could see the southern pasture stretching toward a line of cottonwoods nearly a mile away. Beyond that was another field, then another, 900 acres in all. And for the first time in more than 40 years, Walter had no reliable machine to work them. He climbed down slowly. His right knee hurt when his boot hit the concrete. 10 years earlier, he would have opened the hood immediately, dragged out a toolbox, and stayed there until he found the problem. Now he simply stood beside the tractor. A thin trail of oil ran down the side of the engine block. That was enough to tell him this was not going to be a 10-minute repair. 3 weeks earlier, his last hired hand, Danny, had left for a construction job 2 counties south. Walter couldn't blame him. Construction paid better, offered predictable hours, and didn't require repairing fence in sleet or moving cattle before sunrise. But Danny's departure had left Walter alone. No hired man, no working tractor, and 900 acres entering the fastest growing weeks of the season from the barnyard. The farm didn't look like it was failing. That was the dangerous part. The cattle were still standing at the feed bunk. The windmill was turning the playbill. Barn swallows cut through the morning air as if nothing had changed. But Walter knew what was happening farther out. The north pasture had already been grazed too short near the water tank. The western field was going the opposite direction. Grass there was getting tall and coarse because the cattle rarely walked that far. Along the creek boundary, young cedar and thorny brush were pushing farther into ground that had once been open pasture. 2 fence lines needed repairs. 1 water trough had been leaking for 6 days. And within weeks, parts of the farm would need mowing. Normally, Walter would have attacked that list with diesel fuel. Hook up the mower, cut the rough pasture, move hay, haul feed, pull posts, drag equipment from one end of the property to the other. The tractor had been more than a machine. It had been the muscle that allowed one man to pretend 900 acres were manageable. Now that muscle was sitting dead in the shed. At 10 that morning, Walter called the repair shop. The mechanic listened as Walter described the oil, the noise from the previous week, and the failure to start. There was a pause. "If it's what I think it is," the mechanic said. "You're not looking at a small repair?" Walter asked for a number. The answer made him look back toward the fields. He didn't say anything for several seconds. That afternoon, his neighbor Earl stopped at the gate. Earl looked at the tractor, then at Walter. "You going to fix it?" "Maybe." "You hiring another hand?" Walter shook his head. Earl leaned against his pickup. "Then you better think about selling some ground." Walter had already thought about it. Everyone had. His daughter had mentioned leasing out the far fields. The banker had suggested reducing the herd. A land buyer had called twice that spring. The logic was difficult to argue with. Walter was 71. The farm was 900 acres. And the old system required more labor every year, while Walter had less of it to give probably. That evening, he walked to the fence behind the house. A group of cows had moved away from the bunk and were grazing a strip of fresh grass along the edge of the pasture. Walter watched one tear off a mouthful, then another. Behind her, several others followed. They needed no mower to cut the grass, no wagon to carry it, no diesel engine to bring it to them. Walter looked toward the dark shed where the tractor sat, then back at the cattle. For most of his life, he had asked one question: how could he get enough work done to manage 900 acres? Standing at that fence at 71 years old, with no workers and no working tractor, another question finally occurred to him. What if that had been the wrong question all along? Walter had spent most of his life believing that a good farmer stayed ahead of the work. You cut before the grass got too rough. You hauled hay before the weather changed. You repaired fence before cattle found the weak spot. You moved feed before the bunk went empty. You fixed machinery before the next job depended on it. For decades, that rhythm had worked. But the rhythm had been built around a different version of Walter, at forte. He could climb onto a tractor before sunrise and stay there until dark. At 50, he could wrestle a broken gate back onto its hinges without thinking twice about his back. Even at 60, he could spend half a day cutting pasture, then come home and repair a water line after supper. The farm had not changed much. Walter had, and that was the problem. 2 days after the tractor stopped, he walked through the machinery shed with a yellow legal pad. He began listing every job that depended on horsepower: mowing, moving round bales, dragging fallen limbs, pulling the manure spreader, hauling mineral, cleaning brush from fence lines, moving equipment between pastures. The list filled half the page. Then he made another list. Jobs that depended on another pair of hands: sorting cattle, repairing long stretches of fence, loading hay, moving temporary panels, checking distant water points, working calves. That list was almost as long. Walter stared at the paper. For years, he had thought he owned 900 acres. Now it looked more like 900 acres owned pieces of him. Every field required something. Every gate created another trip. Every machine created maintenance. Every bale created another movement. Every movement required fuel, time, strength, or labor. The farm had become a chain of small obligations tied together by diesel. Walter saw it most clearly at feeding time. That winter, he had moved hundreds of round bales. The process was always the same: grow grass, cut grass, rake grass, bale grass, move the bale, store it, move it again, carry it to cattle. Then later, spread nutrients back across the fields where the cattle had not deposited enough manure themselves. Walter had done it so long that the absurdity of the movement had disappeared. Grass moved to the barn, feed moved to the cattle, manure moved back toward the grass. Machines connected every step, and machines needed fuel. Machines needed repairs. Machines needed someone sitting in the seat. Walter leaned against the door of the shed and looked toward the southern pasture. There were cattle standing on grass growing directly beneath their feet. Yet for much of the year, he spent enormous effort cutting grass somewhere else and carrying it to them. He had never considered that strange. That was simply farming. At least, it was the farming he knew. That afternoon, Walter drove his pickup along the western boundary. The contrast between different parts of the ranch bothered him. Near the main water point, the ground was cropped close. Cattle returned there again and again because water, shade, and familiar paths kept pulling them back. Farther west, grass stood high enough to brush the bottom of his truck. Some plants had already formed seed heads. Below them was older material from the previous season. It wasn't that the farm lacked forage. The cattle simply weren't using it evenly. Walter stopped the truck and stepped out. He pulled a stem between his fingers. The top was coarse. Lower down, green leaves still pushed through. He looked toward the cattle in the distance. They had 4 legs. They could walk. They could harvest grass with their mouths. And wherever they stood, they left manure behind. Walter looked at the pasture again. For years, whenever cattle weren't where the feed was, he moved the feed. Whenever grass wasn't where the cattle were, he used machinery to manage the grass. Maybe that was the part he had never questioned. Not the cattle, not the land, the movement. He had designed the entire farm around moving material with machines, instead of moving animals with decisions. That evening, he unfolded an old property map across the kitchen table. 900 acres looked enormous when shown as one block, so Walter took a pencil and began drawing lines across it. 1 field became 2. 2 became 4. He circled water points, marked shade, noted the overgrazed areas. Then he marked the fields cattle rarely reached. For the first time, he stopped looking at the farm as 900 acres of work. He began looking at it as a pattern of movement. And somewhere inside that pattern was a question he couldn't shake. If most of his labor came from moving grass, feed, manure, and machinery, what would happen if he changed what moved? The next morning, Walter did something that would have felt like wasting time 20 years earlier. He stood still. Instead of climbing into a truck or reaching for a tool, he leaned against a fence post and watched the cattle graze. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. A cow lowered her head, wrapped her tongue around a clump of grass, tore it loose, chewed twice, and stepped forward. Then, another followed, and another. The herd moved slowly across the pasture, without anyone pushing them. Walter watched their feet. Each animal pressed hundreds of pounds into the soil with every step. Some dry stems were eaten, others were knocked flat. Old grass that had stood untouched for months was broken and pressed against the ground. Then one cow lifted her tail. Walter almost laughed. For decades, he had loaded manure into a spreader and burned diesel, hauling fertility back onto fields. The cattle were spreading it themselves, just not where he wanted them to. That was the first piece that clicked. The animals were already cutting grass, already carrying it, already processing it, already returning part of it to the soil. The problem was not that they couldn't do those jobs. The problem was that Walter had almost no control over where they did them. He looked across the pasture. Near the water tank, grass had been bitten repeatedly until much of it was short. 50 yards farther out, plants stood nearly untouched. The cattle were not grazing the pasture evenly. They were selecting. They returned to the softest regrowth first. They lingered near water. They favored familiar paths. Given enough space for enough time, they chose the easiest places again and again while ignoring others. Walter had treated that unevenness as a mowing problem. Maybe it was actually a movement problem. He walked back to the barn and found a roll of old electric fence wire on a shelf. There were also several fiberglass posts left from a temporary lot Danny had built years earlier. Walter carried them into a small field behind the house. He wasn't trying to save 900 acres. Not yet. He wanted to answer one question. Could he control where the cattle worked? He stretched a single temporary line across part of the field. It wasn't pretty. The first corner sagged. One post leaned badly. His hands were slower than he remembered, and bending repeatedly made his knee ache. But before noon, he had divided one pasture into two pieces. Walter opened the gate. The cattle entered the smaller section and immediately spread across fresh grass. At first, he worried he had made the area too tight. The animals moved more than usual. They sampled plants they often ignored. One cow pushed into a patch of taller grass, tore off the leaves, and moved on. Another stepped directly onto a clump of dead stems and flattened them into the soil. Walter followed several yards behind. He began noticing details he had missed from the tractor seat. The cows did not graze every plant to the same height. They didn't behave like a mower. Some grasses were bitten hard. Some were only topped. Some were trampled. And some remained untouched. By late afternoon, the field looked messy, but it looked different. That mattered. The following morning, Walter returned before moving the herd. He crouched beside one of the places where tall, dry grass had been knocked down. Underneath it, the soil was cooler than the bare patch beside it. He picked up a piece of flattened stem. There was nothing miraculous about what he was seeing, but there was something important. The tractor had always made a field look finished. Short, uniform, clean. The cattle were doing something else entirely. They were harvesting part of the pasture while leaving another part behind. They were disturbing the surface. They were depositing manure where they ate. And all Walter had done was decide where they could stand. He looked back toward the machinery shed. For years, his tractor had given him power by doing the work itself. This thin electric wire offered a different kind of power. It did almost no work. It simply controlled where the biological work happened. That distinction stayed with him. Walter rolled the wire forward that afternoon and opened the next strip. The cattle crossed into fresh grass almost immediately. He watched them move. For the first time since the tractor failed, Walter did not feel as if the farm were waiting for him to catch up. He felt as if something on the farm had finally started working with him. But he was about to learn that moving cattle onto fresh grass was the easy part. Knowing when to move them again would be much harder. For the first few days, Walter thought the experiment was working better than he had expected. The cattle entered each new strip eagerly. They ate grass that had been ignored before. They trampled old stems. Manure appeared across places that had rarely received any. And instead of spending hours on the tractor, Walter spent less than 20 minutes moving wire. The simplicity of it was dangerous. It made him believe he understood the system. He didn't. By the end of the first week, Walter began making the temporary paddocks larger, partly because it was easier. His knee had swollen from carrying posts across uneven ground, and moving the fence every day felt unnecessary when there was still grass standing. So he left the cattle in one section for another day, then another. The field still looked green. That was what fooled him. On the third morning, Walter walked through the paddock and noticed several cows returning to places they had already grazed. Fresh green shoots had begun pushing from plants bitten earlier in the week. The cattle found them immediately. They ignored some of the taller, rougher grass nearby and went straight back to the tender regrowth. Walter watched one cow bite the same clump almost to the crown. 2 days later, she found it again. By the time Walter moved the herd, patches across the paddock had been grazed nearly to the ground. Other patches remained tall. The field was still uneven, just uneven in a different way. A week later, the damage became clearer. The heavily grazed plants were slow to recover. Near the water point, hoof traffic had broken the soil surface into bare patches. In one low area that had still been damp, repeated trampling turned the ground into mud. Walter stood there with his hands on his hips. This wasn't regeneration. It looked worse than before. That afternoon, Earl drove past again. He slowed when he saw Walter checking the pasture. "You keep packing them in like that," Earl called through the window. "You won't have anything left by July." Walter didn't answer. The comment irritated him mostly because part of it was true. The cattle were not machinery in the way he had first imagined. A mower cut once and moved on. Cattle could return. They could select the same plant again. They could concentrate around water, and if Walter failed to control time, the same animals that could harvest the pasture could weaken it. That night, he took the property map back to the kitchen table. This time he ignored acreage. Instead, he wrote dates. When had each group entered a paddock? How long had they stayed? When had the grass been bitten the first time? How long before animals returned? That question stopped him. He had been thinking about grazing as an event. Put cattle in. Let them eat. Move them. But the condition of the pasture was being shaped by something that happened after the cattle left. Recovery. The plant needed time to rebuild what had been removed. Walter had spent his life thinking about how much grass existed above the ground. Now he began thinking about how a plant paid for regrowth. Leaves were not just feed. They were the plant's solar panels. Cut too much. Too often. And the plant had less leaf area to rebuild itself. Walter didn't need a textbook to understand what he had already seen. The fastest regrowth attracted the cattle first. If they stayed long enough to bite that regrowth again, the plant was being asked to spend energy twice before it had recovered once. The mistake was not putting animals into a smaller area. The mistake was keeping them there too long. The next morning, Walter changed the experiment. Smaller paddocks, shorter stays, more deliberate movement, and one new rule. Once the cattle left a section, they would not return simply because green grass appeared. The pasture would have to earn enough time to recover. That created a new problem. Walter could control where the cattle were today. But across 900 acres, he had no simple way to know when any field was ready for them again. For the first time, the question was no longer how much land he owned. It was how much recovery time the land required. Walter's first instinct was to make a schedule. 7 days here, 10 days there. Move the cattle clockwise around the property and start again when the rotation was complete. It looked clean on paper. The land refused to cooperate. 3 weeks after his first experiment, Walter returned to the small field behind the house where the cattle had grazed earlier. The grass was already climbing. New leaves had filled the spaces between flattened stems, and from the road the paddock looked ready. So Walter wrote a check mark beside it on his map. Then he drove west. The difference was obvious before he stepped out of the truck. The western pasture had been grazed at nearly the same time, but the plants there were shorter. Some had barely replaced what the cattle had removed. The soil was harder beneath his boots. When Walter pushed a screwdriver into the ground, it stopped after only a few inches. Back near the house, the same screwdriver entered much deeper. Walter stood and looked across both fields. Same cattle, nearly the same grazing date, completely different recovery. His neat schedule suddenly meant very little. Over the next several mornings, Walter stopped trying to calculate the whole farm from the kitchen table. He began walking it. He carried a notebook in his shirt pocket. At each pasture, he wrote down what he saw, not what the calendar said, what the plants said. On the low ground near the creek, the grass stayed green longer. Morning dew remained there after the higher slopes had dried. In a shallow depression, Walter pushed aside the canopy and found darker soil beneath it. On a south-facing rise, the opposite was true. The ground warmed faster. Grass there matured earlier, then slowed quickly once the weather turned dry. A shaded strip along an old tree line behaved differently again. Walter had crossed those places thousands of times, but from a tractor seat, they had all been jobs. Fields to cut, fields to feed, fields to maintain. Now he was beginning to see them as different systems. Water moved differently through each one. Sunlight hit them differently. Plants recovered at different speeds. Even the cattle behaved differently. On hot afternoons, they pulled toward shade and water. On cool mornings, they spread farther. Where forage was tender, they grazed longer. Where grass had become coarse, they passed over more of it. Walter realized something uncomfortable. For decades, he had managed the property according to fences drawn by people. The cattle were responding to boundaries drawn by biology: moisture, slope, shade, plant maturity, distance from water. Those boundaries didn't always match the lines on his map. One evening, Walter spread the property map across the hood of his pickup. Instead of drawing straight lines, he began adding notes. Dries fast, holds moisture, shady after tree pay. Heavy traffic near tank. Slow spring growth, good summer grass. The map became messy. Walter liked it better that way. He was no longer trying to make 900 acres behave like one field. He was trying to understand what each part could tolerate. That changed how he moved the herd. A paddock that looked ready from the road might get another week. A low meadow growing quickly might be used sooner. A dry ridge might need a longer rest even if the rotation said it was next. Walter stopped asking, "Has enough time passed?" He started asking, "Has this pasture actually recovered?" That was a harder question, but it was also a better one. By early summer, the cattle were moving through a patchwork of smaller grazing areas. Walter was spending more time opening gates and shifting wire than driving machinery. And gradually, another pattern appeared. The pastures that were given enough recovery were beginning to hold more usable forage between grazing periods. Not everywhere, not equally, but enough for Walter to notice. For the first time, he began to understand that his real inventory was not acres. It was days of grass. Every pasture was storing a different number of them, and if he learned how to protect those days long enough, he might be able to carry the herd farther into summer without cutting nearly as much hay. That possibility mattered, because the rain was about to stop. By the second week of July, the clouds stopped building over the western ridge. For 3 days, Walter watched the sky and told himself it was temporary. By the 7th day, he stopped believing that. The soil near the barn began to crack along the wheel tracks. The shallow stock pond dropped several inches. Grass on the higher slopes lost its bright green color and took on the dull gray cast Walter knew too well. Summer had turned, and now every decision he had made over the previous 2 months was about to be tested. The first warning came from the cattle. They began walking farther between bites. In spring, they could lower their heads almost anywhere and find something tender. Now they became more selective. They searched the base of taller plants for green leaves. They lingered in the low ground. They spent more time near shade. Walter noticed the change before he saw it on the fields. That mattered. The cattle were telling him forage quality was tightening. His old response would have been automatic. Jut, hai. Move balis. Start feeding. Use machinery to fill the gap. But the tractor was still in the shed. So Walter opened his notebook. He had been recording every paddock the herd entered, when it left, and roughly how much recovery he saw before the next move. For the first time, those notes were more valuable than the repair estimate sitting on his kitchen counter. He drove the property slowly. The north pasture worried him. It had been grazed too hard early in the experiment and had never fully caught up. Walter crossed it off. The western ridge looked worse. The plants were standing, but much of the green had disappeared from the upper leaves. He crossed that off too. Then he reached a lower field near the creek. The difference was small. Tout but visible. There was still green beneath the canopy. Not lush grass. Not abundance. But usable forage. Walter stepped through the fence and pushed the standing material apart with both hands. The soil beneath it was shaded. Cooler. Some of the old stems the cattle had trampled weeks earlier still covered the ground. Walter stared at them. He had once judged a pasture by how clean it looked after grazing. Now the messier field was holding something the clean fields had lost. Protection. The remaining cover shaded the soil surface and slowed how quickly it dried. Walter did not make the mistake of believing that litter could create rain. It couldn't. But it could influence what happened to the moisture already there. That distinction became important. The drought was not making every acre equally poor. Some acres were running out of usable forage faster than others. And Walter's job was no longer to force production everywhere. It was to protect the strongest parts of the farm from being consumed too early. He changed the rotation. Again, the herd moved faster through weaker paddocks. Some areas were skipped entirely. He resisted the urge to put cattle back onto fields, simply because a thin layer of green had appeared. Every time he considered it, he remembered the pasture he had damaged by letting the animals bite regrowth twice. Recovery mattered even more now. When growth slowed, recovery time stretched. A field that might have been ready in spring after a few weeks could need much longer under heat and dry weather. Walter stopped thinking of grazing as a fixed rotation. The cattle were rotating. The recovery was not. That realization forced another decision. He reduced the amount of grass he expected the herd to consume before moving them. At first, leaving forage behind felt wasteful. Every old instinct told him unused. Grass was lost feed. But if he took everything, the soil would be exposed. And if the cattle stayed until every desirable plant was eaten, the best plants would pay the highest price. So Walter began leaving more behind. Not because he had excess, because he didn't. The less rain they received, the more carefully he had to protect the plants that remained. By late July, several neighboring farms had begun hauling additional hay to pasture. Walter wasn't immune. He knew he might have to do the same. There was no trick that could guarantee grass without rainfall. But his cattle were still harvesting a portion of their feed directly from fields that had received enough recovery. Each day they grazed instead of being fed. A bale was one less bale. Walter had to move. That changed the economics of the problem. One evening, Earl stopped beside the road again. He looked toward the herd grazing a narrow strip of standing forage. "Thought you'd be feeding hay by now." "So did I," Walter said. Earl studied the field. "You grow more grass?" Walter shook his head. "No." He looked across the paddocks behind them. "I just stopped spending it all at once." That night, Walter wrote a sentence at the bottom of his notebook. He underlined it twice. Grass isn't just feed. It's time. Every field he allowed to recover was storing days he might need later. And for the first time, Walter understood that surviving 900 acres without more labor might depend less on producing more grass than on learning when not to use the grass he already had. For most of his life, Walter had measured the farm the same way everyone else did. 900 acres. It was the number on the deed, the number the banker used, the number buyers asked about, the number neighbors repeated when they talked about whether he was getting too old to keep the place. But by August, Walter had begun to distrust that number. 900 acres told him how much land he owned. It did not tell him how long the cattle could eat. That was the number that mattered now. One morning, Walter stood beside a paddock with his notebook open. He estimated how much usable forage remained. Not perfectly. He wasn't weighing grass or calculating laboratory samples. He was learning by comparison. This paddock might carry the herd for 2 days. That one perhaps 4. The low meadow, if protected another week, might give him 6. The dry ridge might not be worth using at all. He began writing numbers beside the fields. 2 days. 4 days. Skip. Check next week. For the first time, the map on his kitchen table began to look less like real estate and more like a pantry. Some shelves were nearly empty. Others still held something. The problem was deciding when to open them. Walter had made this mistake before. When grass looked available, he used it. Now he asked a different question. If he used this field today, what would he wish he still had 30 days from now? That question changed his behavior more than any machine ever had. He began protecting certain paddocks deliberately. They were not the greenest. They were the ones most likely to remain useful later. Some had deeper soil. Some held moisture longer. Some had enough standing material to shade the ground. Walter started thinking of those places as reserve fields. He passed them repeatedly without opening the gate. That was difficult. A farmer was supposed to use what he had. Walter was learning that sometimes the most valuable grass on the farm was the grass he refused to graze. Each evening, he added up what he believed remained. Not acres. Days. 23 days of grazing. Maybe 26 if the lower field recovered. Fewer if the heat continued. More if rain returned. The estimate changed constantly. That was the point. The farm had stopped being a fixed quantity. It had become a moving balance between what the cattle consumed and what the land could replace. Walter also began noticing how much time he had once spent creating feed that cattle now harvested themselves. A round bale required more than grass. It required cutting, drying, raking, baling, moving, storage. Then another trip when the cattle finally ate it. Out in the paddock, the animal performed the harvest itself. Walter still needed stored feed. He knew winter would come. He knew drought could become severe enough that grazing alone would not carry the herd, but every extra grazing day postponed the moment when he had to start moving feed. That mattered because moving feed was exactly the kind of work his old system had made him dependent on. One afternoon, Walter counted the bales remaining from the previous season. He stood in the hay shed longer than necessary. There were more than he had expected, not because he had produced more, because he had started using them later. That was the first proof he could measure without looking at a pasture. The farm had not suddenly become more productive. Walter had simply stopped converting every problem into a machine job. A few days later, Earl came by while Walter was moving a fence. He watched Walter pull 3 posts, step forward, and reset the line. The cattle waited on the other side. "How long does that take you?" Earl asked. "Depends." 10 minutes? Closer to 15. Earl looked toward the machinery shed. "And you're doing this instead of fixing the tractor?" Walter pushed the final post into the ground. "No." He opened the temporary line. The herd moved toward fresh forage. Walter watched them cross. "I'm doing this so the tractor doesn't decide whether the farm works." That evening, he returned to the kitchen table. The map was covered in pencil, dates, arrows, water points, recovery notes, days of forage. Walter looked at the original property lines beneath all of it. 900 acres. The number suddenly felt less intimidating. He did not need to work all 900 acres. He needed to control when the cattle reached each piece of them. And if he could keep enough grass ahead of the herd, something else might become possible. For the first time, Walter began wondering whether he had been solving only half the problem. He had reduced the need for machinery. Now he needed to find out whether he could reduce the need for hired labor too. Walter had spent most of the summer learning how to move cattle. Now he had to learn how to move himself less. That distinction mattered. At 71. Every unnecessary trip across the farm had a cost. Every extra gate, every heavy post, every water problem discovered too late, every tool left at the wrong end of 900 acres. The old system assumed labor was cheap. Walter's body was teaching him otherwise. So he began paying attention to something he had ignored for years. Steps, not acres. Steps. How many times did he climb in and out of the truck? How far did he carry fence posts? How often did he cross the same field because something had been forgotten? How many jobs required lifting instead of simply opening, closing, or turning something? He started redesigning the routine around those questions. The first change was small. He stopped carrying a large pile of posts every time he moved cattle. Instead, he kept bundles at several points along the rotation. A few near the creek, a few behind the barn, another group in the western pasture. It saved only minutes. But minutes were not the real savings. It saved his knees. Next came the wire. Walter learned to place temporary fencing, so the next move required changing only one side whenever possible. Instead of rebuilding an entire paddock, he advanced a single boundary. Pull 3 posts. Walk forward. Reset them. Roll the wire. Open the next strip. The cattle did the rest. A job that once sounded impossible, when he imagined managing 900 acres, became a sequence of 15-minute decisions. But water was harder. Cattle could walk to grass. They still needed access to water. And if Walter forced them to return to one permanent tank every day, they would keep concentrating traffic around the same places. The paths would deepen. The nearby grass would suffer, and much of the land he wanted to use would remain inconvenient. So Walter began planning rotations around the water points already available. He did not attempt to rebuild the whole farm at once. That would have created a different version of the same problem: too much money, too much labor, too much infrastructure. Instead, he asked one question about every field: what is the simplest way to make this usable? Sometimes the answer was a gate. Sometimes a short run of hose. Sometimes moving the fence 20 yards. Sometimes it was deciding not to use that piece yet. That last answer was new for Walter. His younger self had believed every problem needed fixing immediately. The 71-year-old version had begun to understand that some problems could simply be avoided by late summer. His mornings had changed completely. He no longer walked into the shed wondering which machine demanded attention. He checked cattle, checked water, looked at the next paddock, looked at the one they had left. Then he decided whether to move. Some mornings, the most important job on 900 acres took less time than repairing one broken belt on a mower. That did not mean the farm had become easy. Fence still broke. Water lines still leaked. Cattle still ignored Walter's plans occasionally. One afternoon, a calf slipped under the temporary wire, and the rest of the herd began following. Walter spent nearly an hour putting them back. Another morning, he discovered a trough nearly empty, because a connection had come loose overnight. The system still required attention, but attention was different from brute force. That was the advantage Walter had not understood at first. A tractor multiplied muscle. A good layout multiplied decisions. The first required fuel, repairs, and a body in the seat. The second required Walter to notice what would happen next. He became obsessed with preventing work. Before moving cattle, he checked whether the next water source was ready. Before leaving a paddock, he positioned posts for the following move. If he drove to the far end of the property, he carried everything he might need: wire, pliers, insulators, notebook, a handful of staples. He stopped making trips without a reason. By September, Walter could move the herd through parts of the farm that once would have required mowing, hauling feed, or opening several permanent gates. He did it with a pickup, a small collection of fencing equipment, and time spent observing. One evening, he parked beside the machinery shed. The broken tractor was still there. Dust had settled across the hood. Walter placed the roll of polywire on the workbench beside it. The contrast almost amused him. One machine weighed several tons. The other tool could be carried under one arm. The tractor had once allowed Walter to overpower the farm. The wire allowed him to direct something stronger than himself: a herd. Walter ran his hand across the spool. He finally understood what had changed. He wasn't finding a way for one old man to perform the labor of 5 younger men. He was removing the jobs that required 5 men in the first place. And that raised a much bigger question. If the farm could operate with less machinery and less labor, how much had the old way actually been costing him? Walter had never been afraid of expenses. Every farm had them: fuel, repairs, feed, fence, veterinary bills, parts that broke at the worst possible time. For years, he had treated those costs as separate problems. Then one rainy afternoon in September, he sat at the kitchen table and began putting them on the same page. The tractor repair estimate was first. He wrote the number at the top. Under it, he added what he had spent on diesel the previous year. Then hired labor. Then mower repairs. Then the fuel used hauling hay. Then the hours spent moving bales from one side of the property to the other. Some numbers were exact. Others were estimates. The pattern did not need precision to become obvious. The expensive part wasn't one broken tractor. The expensive part was a farming system that required the tractor to keep functioning. Walter leaned back in his chair. If he repaired it tomorrow, what would happen? He already knew. The tractor would return to work. He would mow fields. Cattle had not grazed properly. He would move hay. He would haul feed. He would drag equipment. Eventually something else would break. The repair would solve the machine. It would not solve the system. That realization bothered him more than the original estimate. For most of his life, Walter had thought machinery saved labor, and it did. But machinery also made certain kinds of labor possible at a scale that eventually made the farm dependent on them. A bigger mower made it practical to mow more acres. A bigger tractor made it practical to move larger bales. Larger bales made it practical to feed more cattle from one location. Then those cattle concentrated manure near feeding areas. Then Walter needed equipment to manage what had accumulated. Each solution created another job downstream. He looked at the notebook he had kept through the summer. The new system was not free. There was wire to replace, posts to buy, water fittings, fence repairs, time spent checking cattle, and mistakes had cost too. The early overgrazed paddock was proof of that, but the difference was where the work happened. Instead of spending hours moving material after it had been harvested, Walter was spending minutes deciding where animals harvested it. That changed more than fuel use. It changed the sequence. Under the old system, Walter often touched the same grass several times. He cut it, raked it, baled it, moved it, stored it, moved it again, then fed it. With grazing, the cow touched it once. Walter began thinking in trips. One round bale might require a tractor trip to move it to storage, and another to carry it back to cattle. Multiply that by hundreds of bales. Multiply that by years. The farm had contained thousands of miles of movement that produced nothing by themselves. They existed only because feed and animals had been separated. Walter walked out to the hay shed. He counted the remaining bales again. There were still more than he expected. He had not eliminated hay. He never expected to. Winter would still come. Bad weather would still force him to feed. Stored forage was insurance. But insurance was different from dependency. That distinction mattered. The next morning, Walter drove past the broken tractor without stopping. Instead, he went to the paddock. The cattle had entered the previous evening. They were spread across the strip. No feeding tractor. No wagon. No man standing beside a bunk. The cattle moved forward one mouthful at a time. Walter opened his notebook. He began a new page. This time, he did not write expenses. He wrote jobs. Mowing less. Hauling feed less. Moving manure, almost none. Checking water more important. Moving fence more frequent. Watching recovery essential. Walter stared at the list. He had not eliminated work. He had exchanged one kind of work for another. That was the real change. He had traded heavy, mechanical work for lighter, more frequent decisions. At 71, that trade was worth more than it would have been at 40. A younger Walter had possessed enough strength to survive an inefficient system. An older Walter needed a system that rewarded judgment instead. 2 weeks later, the mechanic called again. A used replacement tractor had become available. Good condition. Fair price. The kind of call Walter once would have considered an opportunity. He thanked the mechanic and said he would think about it. After hanging up, Walter walked to the window. The cattle were moving toward the temporary fence. Waiting for the next strip, Walter looked at them. For the first time, buying another tractor no longer felt like the obvious way to save the farm. It felt like a decision that needed to justify itself. And somewhere between that realization and the first frost, someone else began noticing that the old man who was supposed to be losing control of 900 acres wasn't acting like a man preparing to sell by October. The farm looked different. Not cleaner. Different. There were still rough edges along the creek. Some paddocks carried tall stems Walter had deliberately left behind. Certain fields looked almost untidy compared with the clipped pastures he once preferred. But the cattle were still grazing. That was what people noticed. The first was Earl. He stopped his pickup beside the south fence one afternoon and watched the herd move into a fresh strip. Walter was 20 yards away. Rolling up the old wire, Earl climbed out. "You still haven't fixed that tractor?" Walter shook his head. No. Earl looked over the cattle, then toward the pasture they had just left. You feeding hay yet? Not much. That answer made Earl quiet. Earlier in the summer, several farms nearby had begun feeding earlier than usual. Dry weather had shortened their grazing season. Walter had expected to do the same. Instead, the fields he had rested longest were still carrying enough forage to keep the herd moving. Not indefinitely, not through winter, but longer than he had expected. Earl stepped over the ditch. What did you put on that field? Nothing. No fertilizer? No. Earl stared at him. Walter pointed toward the cattle. I mostly stopped taking them back before the grass was ready. That was not the answer Earl expected. Walter could see it. People preferred explanations that could be purchased. A new seed mix. A fertilizer program. A machine. Something with a price tag. Waiting did not sound like management. But Walter had learned that waiting was one of the hardest things to do well. 2 days later, another vehicle arrived. This one belonged to a land broker named Cole Mercer. Cole had called twice in spring. He represented a buyer interested in assembling several properties in the area. Back then, his timing had made sense. Walter was 71. His hired man was gone. The tractor was dead. 900 acres looked like too much responsibility for one person. Cole had assumed pressure would eventually make the decision for him. He parked near the house and walked toward Walter. Still thinking about that offer? Walter wiped his hands on his jeans. Not much. Cole smiled as if Walter had misunderstood. The buyer may be willing to improve it. Improve what? The offer. Walter looked beyond him toward the cattle. A temporary fence divided the pasture into narrow sections. Behind the herd, the previously grazed ground had already begun, another recovery cycle. Ahead of them stood grass Walter had been protecting. In spring, Walter had looked at 900 acres and seen obligations. Now he saw sequence. He knew which pasture would be next. Which one needed more rest. Which water point needed checking. Which field he wanted to protect until later. The place no longer felt like something he was losing control of. Cole followed his eyes. You running this yourself? Mostly. No hired help? Not regular. Cole looked toward the machinery shed. And the tractor? Still broken. For the first time, the broker's expression changed. He had expected deterioration. Instead, he was standing in front of a farm that was still functioning, despite the two things everyone believed it required. Labor. Machinery. How? Walter thought about giving him a long explanation. Instead, he picked up the roll of wire beside his boot. I stopped asking machines to solve every problem. Cole looked at the spool, then at 900 acres behind it. The contrast was almost ridiculous. But Walter understood something Cole did not. The wire was not replacing the tractor. The cattle were not replacing the tractor either. The real replacement was control. Control over where animals ate. Control over how long they stayed. Control over when a pasture was rested. Control over which acres were used now and which were saved for later. The equipment only made those decisions possible. Cole made a higher offer before leaving. Walter did not accept it. That evening, he sat on the porch as the light faded over the western pasture. 6 months earlier, a sale had represented escape. Sell the distant ground. Reduce the herd. Make the problem smaller. Now Walter saw the irony. The farm had not become easier because there was less of it. It had become easier because he had stopped trying to physically control every acre. He controlled the herd instead. The herd controlled where grazing happened. Recovery controlled when the land was ready again. The system was beginning to replace force with timing, and Walter was finally understanding the difference. The next morning, he opened the machinery shed. Dust still covered the tractor. He climbed onto the step and sat behind the wheel. For a moment, he remembered what the machine had meant to him. Strength, independence, the ability to handle more land than one man should have been able to manage. Then he looked through the windshield toward the paddocks. The tractor had once made him capable of doing more work, but the farm no longer needed as much work done. Walter stepped back down. He closed the shed door. And for the first time since the engine failed, he knew he was not trying to get his old farm back. The first hard frost came in early November. Walter walked the southern pasture just after sunrise. his boots whitening the grass with every step. The cattle stood behind the temporary wire, waiting. He pulled 3 posts, rolled the line forward, and opened the next section. The herd moved past him quietly. No engine started, no mower turned, no feed wagon followed. Walter stood there watching until something finally became clear. He had spent months telling himself that cattle were replacing machinery. That wasn't quite true. The cattle could harvest grass. They could carry themselves to feed in too. They could return manure directly to the field. Their hooves could knock standing material down, but they could also overgraze. They could concentrate around water. They could damage wet ground. Left alone long enough, they would repeatedly choose the same desirable plants. The cattle were not the solution. They were power, and power without control could create as many problems as a tractor. What had changed the farm was the system around them. Walter looked at the wire in his hand. It decided where the animals could graze. The water points influenced where they traveled. His observations determined when they moved. The condition of the plants determined when they could return. And recovery, something Walter had once barely considered, now controlled the rhythm of everything. The tractor had managed land by force. Cut this field, carry that bale, move this manure, clear those weeds. Walter's new system managed the sequence instead. Graze here, leave, wait, watch, return only when the field was ready. It sounded almost too simple, but simplicity had taken him an entire season to understand. That afternoon, Walter opened his old maintenance records. For years, the farm calendar had been organized around machinery, spring servicing, mower preparation, hay equipment, fuel deliveries, repair windows, hours on engines. Now he compared that calendar with the notebook he had kept since summer. The new pages contained different information: grazing dates, recovery, water, forage conditions, weather, places the herd had stayed too long, fields he had skipped deliberately. The difference between the 2 books startled him. The first recorded what machines needed. The second recorded what the land was doing. Walter ran his finger down the page. That was the change. For most of his life, he had reacted to jobs. Now he was reacting to signals. If grass slowed, he extended recovery. If a paddock remained wet, he kept animals off it. If one section held forage better, he protected it for later. If cattle began returning to fresh regrowth, he moved them. The farm still demanded decisions every day, but those decisions weighed almost nothing. A decision did not require a transmission. It did not burn diesel. It did not need a younger back. Walter finally understood why the system fit him now. At 71, his greatest limitation was physical capacity. But age had not taken his ability to notice patterns. If anything, decades on the same land had given him more of that. He remembered where water stood after heavy rain, which ridges dried first, where cattle searched for shade, which fields greened earliest, which places stayed productive longer into summer. Things he once considered background knowledge had become operating information. His age had removed one advantage, strength, but it had revealed another, experience. Near sunset, Walter walked past the tractor again. He no longer hated the machine. There was nothing wrong with tractors. There were still jobs where one would save enormous time. Walter might repair this one eventually. He might buy another someday. But if he did, it would enter a different farm. The machine would serve the system. The system would no longer serve the machine. Walter stopped at the doorway and looked back across the property. 900 acres. In spring. That number had frightened him, because he imagined all the work required to control it. Now he understood that he never needed to control 900 acres at once. He needed to control one decision at a time. Where the cattle went next, how long they stayed, what they left behind, and how much time the land received before they returned. The farm had not been saved by a broken tractor. It had been saved by what the broken tractor forced Walter to stop doing. For the first time in 50 years, he had stopped asking how much work he could force himself to complete. He had started asking how much work the farm could eliminate. And that was the question that allowed a 71-year-old man to keep 900 acres. Winter arrived quietly. By December, The grass had lost most of its color, and frost stayed in the shaded places well past noon. Walter was feeding hay now. There was no miracle that changed that. Grass stopped growing. Cold weather came. Cattle still needed feed. Some mornings Walter still wished the old tractor would start when he turned the key. But something fundamental had changed. He no longer needed it to prove the farm could survive. One morning, Walter opened the machinery shed and stood beside the tractor that had failed 8 months earlier. The same oil stain remained beneath the engine. Dust covered the hood. He wiped a line through it with his finger. Back in spring, this machine had represented everything he believed he was losing. Strength, capacity, independence. Without it, 900 acres had seemed impossible. Now Walter understood the mistake. The tractor had never made the farm independent. It had made the farm dependent on a certain kind of work. Mowing, hauling, moving feed, moving manure, dragging equipment across long distances. As long as Walter was strong enough to keep doing those jobs, the dependency had been invisible. Age exposed it. So did the broken engine. Walter stepped outside. Across the yard, several round bales waited for the cattle. He still used equipment when he could borrow it. He still hired help for jobs. One man should not attempt alone. There were fences he could not rebuild by himself. There were veterinary days when another pair of hands was necessary, and no grazing system could guarantee forage through every drought or winter. Walter had not discovered a way to farm without machines. He had discovered something more useful: how to stop building every farm decision around them. That afternoon, he carried his summer notebook into the kitchen. The first pages were messy, dates scratched out, paddocks drawn badly, questions in the margins. Farther in, the notes became more precise. Rest longer. Move before. Regrowth is bitten. Save lower field. Check water first. Skip dry ridge. Then came the line he had underlined twice in July. Grass isn't just feed. It's time. Walter smiled when he read it. That sentence had changed the way he saw the property. For decades, 900 acres meant distance. More fence. More fuel. More repairs. More hours. Now each acre meant something different. Recovery. Forage. Shod. Water. Timing. The land had stopped being one enormous job. It had become a series of choices. That was why Walter had kept it. Not because he had become stronger. Not because someone had returned to work for him. Not because the tractor had been repaired. He had kept 900 acres because he no longer tried to perform 900 acres worth of labor. The following spring, Walter finally called the mechanic. They repaired the tractor. It cost money Walter would have preferred not to spend, but the machine still had useful work left in it. When it returned to the farm, Walter parked it in the same shed. The next morning, however, he did not climb onto it. He picked up a roll of polywire. The cattle were waiting. Walter walked toward the pasture and shifted the fence. The herd moved into fresh grass. Behind them, the previous paddock began another period of rest. The tractor remained parked. It would be used when a tractor was the right tool, nothing more. Walter stopped beside the fence and looked across the farm. 900 acres still stretched beyond what he could see from one place. He was 72 now. His knees had not improved. His back had not become younger. He could not work the way he had at 40, and he no longer wanted to. For most of his life, Walter believed successful farming meant becoming capable of doing more. More acres. More hay. More machinery. More work before dark. Age taught him the opposite lesson. A farm that could only survive while its owner was young, strong, and constantly moving was not truly resilient. The farm worth keeping was the one that could change. As the farmer changed, Walter rested one hand on the fence post. The cattle grazed quietly beyond him. He had spent 50 years trying to become strong enough for the farm. At 71, he finally redesigned the farm so it no longer required him to be, and that was how one old man, with no workers and a broken tractor, kept 900 acres from becoming somebody else's land.